The biggest mistake in political fantasy isn't what you think it is. In fact, it often happens long before the first political scheme even unfolds. After spending over 2 decades crafting fantasy worlds and analyzing the political systems of others, I've discovered what makes political fantasy stories work, and more importantly, what makes them fall apart. So in this video, I'm not only sharing 6 crucial dangers that can derail your story, but I'll also show you the specific techniques to fix them. What if I told you that one of the most common mistakes in political fantasy isn't about politics at all? I remember when I first started writing, I thought political conflict was all about the good guys versus the bad guys. But here's the thing, real politics is never that simple, so why should your fantasy story? Take the War of the Roses, which inspired A Song of Ice and Fire. There wasn't a clear good or bad side here. Both houses had legitimate claims to the throne, yet both also committed terrible acts. This complexity is what made it such compelling source material for George R.R. Martin. When we reduce political systems to simple good versus evil, we're not just oversimplifying, we're missing out on the rich storytelling opportunities that come from nuanced conflict. Think about it for a moment. If one side is clearly evil, why would anyone support them? Why haven't they been overthrown already? The answer to this often lies in the complex web of relationships, obligations, and beliefs that maintain power structures. I found that the most engaging political fantasy emerges when every faction has valid motivations and reasonable concerns. Take Dune by Frank Herbert as an example here. The Fremen resist imperial control not because they're rebels by nature, but because they're protecting their planet's ecology and their way of life. Even the seemingly villainous Harkonnens act from deep-rooted beliefs about power and survival. This approach creates tension that feels real because it mirrors how actual political conflicts work. No one sees themselves as the villain. Everyone believes they are doing what's necessary for their people, their beliefs, or their vision of the future. When I'm developing political factions in my stories now, I always ask myself, what do they want and why do they believe they are right? These simple questions help avoid the oversimplification trap, helping me to create more compelling conflicts. And now that you understand why oversimplification weakens your story, let me show you another danger that often goes hand in hand with it, one that can make your readers question the authenticity of your entire world. In medieval Europe, the concept of human rights as we know them today didn't exist. Yet many fantasy writers unknowingly built their entire political conflicts around modern ideals. This is something I too struggled with in my early writing. I would create fantasy worlds with medieval technology and aesthetics, but then I would also have characters champion ideas about equality, democracy, and individual rights that wouldn't emerge for centuries. Here's what I've learned from that. It's not about avoiding modern values entirely, it's about understanding how different societies view the world. In medieval times, people didn't think in terms of individual rights, but in terms of duties, obligations, and divine order. A noble's responsibility to protect their peasants was seen as a sacred duty, not a matter of human rights. So instead of writing about characters fighting for modern ideals, successful political fantasy often explores conflicts authentic to their world's context. People throughout history have always wanted justice, security, and dignity. They just understood these concepts differently than we do today. A medieval character might seek justice not through legal reform, but by appealing to divine law or traditional customs. I found that authors like Robert Jordan excel at this. In The Wheel of Time, he creates societies where channeling magic fundamentally shapes social order. The conflicts arise not from modern political debates, but from deeply ingrained beliefs about gender roles, power dynamics, and prophesied destiny. In our world, different cultures throughout history have understood concepts like legitimacy and leadership in fascinating ways. Some believed divine favor showed through victory in battle. Others saw harmony with natural cycles as the mark of good governance. Understanding these historical perspectives can enrich your fantasy worlds immensely. When I'm writing now, I try to think about what values would naturally emerge from my world's history and circumstances. What do people in this society consider right and wrong? What assumptions about power, justice, and governance would they never think to question? Those questions help a lot to avoid overly modernizing my stories. But speaking of staying true to your world's context, there is another danger lurking in the shadows of political fantasy. Imagine spending months crafting the perfect political system for your fantasy world, only to realize halfway through your story that your own rules make your main plot impossible. I've been there, and it's not a fun place to be. Consider an example where you've established that your council needs unanimous agreement to take action, but then you need them to make a controversial decision. Or you've created a magical inheritance system only to realize it prevents your protagonist from claiming the rightful throne. Brandon Sanderson handles this quite well in Mistborn, for example. His political system is based on strict social hierarchies and magical inheritance, but instead of breaking his own rules when they become inconvenient, he uses them to create compelling conflicts. The consistency of his world's rules makes the characters' struggles feel more authentic and their victories more earned. Political systems aren't just about who holds power, they're about how that power flows through society. Every rule creates both opportunities and constraints. When characters must work within established rules to achieve their goals, their victories feel earned rather than contrived. In my own writing, I found that political consistency goes beyond just tracking rules and hierarchies. It extends to how different parts of society interact. Trade guilds influence noble houses, religious institutions shape succession laws, military traditions affect diplomatic protocols. These interconnections create a rich tapestry of cause and effect that makes your world feel alive. Here's how I've learned to maintain consistency in my political fantasy. First, I create a simple document outlining the basic rules of my political system. Who holds power, how is it transferred, and what are the hard limits? Then I test these rules against my main plot points. Can my major story events actually happen within this system? If not, I either need to adjust the system or find a more interesting way to achieve my plot goals within the established rules. When readers can trust that your world follows its own rules, they are more likely to invest in the story's conflicts. Now, if you found anything useful in the video so far, please consider giving it a like to help me grow the channel. Thank you. Moving on, while consistency is crucial, there's an even more subtle danger that can slip into your story, one that many celebrated fantasy authors have had to learn to overcome. Have you ever found yourself writing 3 pages explaining how your fantasy senate works, only to wonder if you're boring your readers to tears? I certainly have. It's tempting to share every detail of our carefully crafted political systems. We want readers to understand exactly how our world works. But I've learned that when it comes to politics and fantasy, less is often more. Think about how Joe Abercrombie handles politics in the first Law trilogy. We learn about the Union's political system not through lengthy explanations, but through watching characters navigate its complexities and suffer its consequences. Every detail serves the story. Political world building should be like seasoning in cooking, just enough to enhance the flavor without overpowering the dish. Each detail you reveal should either move the plot forward, deepen character relationships, or raise the stakes of the current conflict. If it doesn't serve one of these purposes, save it for your world building notes. I've personally found that the best political world building is like an iceberg. Readers only need to see the tip, but they should feel the weight of what lies beneath. George R. R. Martin masters this in A Song of Ice and Fire. He reveals the complex web of alliances and feudal obligations through pivotal scenes like royal visits, tournaments, and small council meetings, letting us learn the political landscape through events rather than exposition. Political details land particularly effective when they are revealed through conflict. Instead of explaining how your council system works, show a character dealing with its frustrating procedures. Rather than describing succession laws, show how they can trap your characters in difficult situations. When I'm writing political fantasy now, I ask myself 3 questions before including any political detail. Does this information affect the current scene? Will it matter to the plot later? Can I show this through action instead of explanation? If I cannot answer yes to at least one of these questions, that detail probably doesn't need to be included, no matter how clever I think it is. But now that you know how to share your political system without overwhelming readers, let me tell you about a fundamental challenge that every fantasy writer faces. Why do some political systems feel fresh and exciting, while others feel like medieval Europe with different names? The answer lies in how we approach our inspiration. I used to think that creating a unique political system for a fantasy story meant avoiding all real-world influences. But I've learned that originality doesn't come from ignoring history, it comes from understanding it deeply enough to remix it in meaningful ways. Look at how different cultures throughout history have handled succession, justice, or the relationship between religion and state. The Aztec Empire's system of tribute cities worked very differently from European feudalism. The Venetian Republic developed its complex election system to prevent any single family from dominating the city. Steppe empires, on the other hand, created sophisticated systems for managing vast territories with relatively small populations. Understanding why these systems worked in their context helps us create more believable fantasy politics. So when I'm creating a political system now, I study multiple historical examples and ask myself, what if these different approaches had evolved together? What if this system had developed under different circumstances? This is how you get truly unique political systems that still feel authentic. For example, you might combine aspects of Venetian merchant politics with Polynesian navigation-based power structures, or blend the Roman client-state system with the way nomadic steppe empires manage conquered territories. Fantasy allows us to explore how different circumstances might shape political development. What if a society had to build its political system around managing magical resources? How would the presence of multiple sapient species affect governance? What if physical transformation magic made inheritance laws dramatically more complicated? These are all fascinating and unique questions to explore, but even with such fantastical elements, looking at history can help to make everything feel more grounded. Now, if you're hungry for even more practical tips, make sure to sign up for my free weekly newsletter. It's packed with bite-sized, actionable advice to transform your world building and fantasy writing in just 5 minutes a week. You can find the link in the description below. Moving on, creating an original political system isn't enough if it doesn't serve your story. And that leads us to our final and most crucial consideration. Every political decision in your fantasy world needs to matter to your characters personally. This is perhaps the most important lesson I've learned about political fantasy. Politics only engage readers when it affects characters they care about. The fate of kingdoms means nothing if we don't understand how it impacts individual lives. But too many writers keep their politics disconnected from their characters. Instead, think about how George R. Martin handles this in A Song of Ice and Fire. Every political decision has personal consequences. The Game of Thrones isn't just about who sits on the Iron Throne. It's about how political machinations tear families apart, force impossible choices, and reveal character. Political decisions should create personal dilemmas that test characters' values and relationships. A treaty negotiation becomes compelling when it forces a character to choose between peace and justice. A succession crisis matters when it pits duty against family loyalty. I found that the most compelling political fantasy happens when personal and political conflicts are inseparable. Your protagonist's personal goals should either align with or conflict with the political realities of your world in interesting ways. A ruler might have to sacrifice their own happiness for the good of their people. A reformer might discover that achieving their goals would hurt those they love. So when I'm writing political fantasy now, I make sure every major political event in my story changes something important in at least one main character's life, forces characters to make difficult choices, and reveals something about who they are and what they value. Remember, readers don't engage with political systems, they engage with characters navigating those systems. So make your politics personal and your readers will care about the fate of your fantasy kingdom. Looking back at these 6 dangers, they all point to one fundamental truth. Effective political fantasy isn't about creating complex political systems, it's about using those systems to tell compelling human stories. When you avoid oversimplification, understand historical context, maintain consistency, balance exposition, draw from diverse influences, and connect politics to characters, you create political fantasy that doesn't just intrigue readers, it moves them. Now obviously, these aren't rigid rules, but guidelines based on my own experience. So take what resonates with you and leave the rest, because the most important thing is to create a political system that serves your own story. However you approach politics though, it needs to be grounded in proper world building, because otherwise it will definitely fall apart at some point. So watch this video here next and follow along through the entire world building fundamentals series.